Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, who is the advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a brief overview of the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Ahnaf, and good evening from a sweltering Israel. Just for those who don't know, today's temperature in Israel is at an all-time high since, temperatures were being recorded. Really hot even for August here. But that's the reality we live in these days. Anyway, on to the main topics. First of all, let's talk about Israel's conundrum, because for the last few weeks, maybe even months, one could argue, it seems unclear exactly for many onlookers in Israel and abroad, exactly what is the Israeli government strategy for ending the war, which everybody claims they want to do, including the Israeli government. Obviously, the Israeli government say that they want the war to end in a victory, which for them means a release of the hostages, Hamas to lay down its weapons, and cease their rule in any way, shape or form of the Gaza Strip. Now, to get there, probably has to be some sort of a deal. I think that's clear. The idea of killing every single member of Hamas or every Hamas sympathizer is impossible. So really the only way to do it is to put as much pressure on Hamas that they come to the table. And as I've said for a number of weeks, my main belief is that Netanyahu does want a deal. He realizes that a trap to a certain extent was set for Israel, and the only way to get out of it is to get a good deal. I think he wants a deal. I think he wants to end the war in Gaza with as much of a victory, quote unquote, as possible. But there's a bit of a catch-22 situation for Israel, which goes along the following. To get the deal, Israel has to take a strong and as hawkish a position as possible. We hear the comments coming out from the Israeli government. We see and witness the plans that have been laid to conquer the Gaza Strip. Some would say Gaza City. When the Israeli government spokespeople talk about Gaza, sometimes they're talking about Gaza as a whole, sometimes they're talking about Gaza City. Perhaps that is intended to confuse. Perhaps that's part of the point. But the fact is that we've been hearing a lot of very hawkish comments coming out of the Israeli government in recent days and recent weeks, with this idea to conquer at least Gaza City and the first phase, which is the last real holdout for Hamas, both militarily and on a governance level. Israel did go through Gaza very, very early in the war, but has kind of left it to a certain extent since then. There is said to be between 800,000 and a million people living there. So it's not going to be easy. Israel wants to try and get as many civilians away from out of harm's way, pushing them south towards the humanitarian centers where they can get fed, they can even get education, as has been shown recently, and everything else that's needed for people who are at this point in time homeless. But the fact is that Israel is gearing up for a major offensive on Gaza City. The IDF chief of staff gave the approval for that plan today. The problem is, as I said, I think if a deal was on the table tomorrow, Netanyahu would take it rather than go for this offensive. But he has to look tough. And it's largely, I believe, a negotiating tactic to show Hamas that if you do not give up, if you do not come to the table, if you do not make a deal, it will hurt you. Not just in terms of casualties, but also your rule could be ended militarily. The problem with that is then the West condemns these plans, condemns these comments, condemns these maneuvers, which then strengthens and bolsters Hamas's position and keeps them away from the negotiating table. So there's a bit of a problem there because, as I said, Netanyahu wants to get back to the negotiating table. He wants to negotiate a deal, but to do that, it has to come from a position of strength. But that strength then puts off a lot in the West, who then make these statements about recognizing a Palestinian state and condemns Israel and everything that's going on, which bolsters Hamas. And that's where we've been. We've been in this kind of cycle now for a number of weeks, and it's ensured that exactly what the international community claim they want doesn't happen, which is a ceasefire deal, which is an end to the war. So the West, to a certain extent, large numbers of them, and we know who they are really helping, or not, at least they're not helping end this war. In fact, they're hindering an end to this war because they are bolstering Hamas. Every time we hear a comment from a world leader, whether it is French President Emmanuel Macron, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, or Australian Prime Minister Albanese, or many others, Hamas congratulates them. They see it as a win, and regardless of what the leaders themselves say, Hamas see it as a great prize. And again, they're thinking to themselves, why do we need to go back to the negotiating table when we are going to get far less there than if we just sit it out? We try and ruin Israel's reputation. We come out with this starvation campaign. Again, as I've said in previous weeks, not to say that the Palestinian people are not suffering, but many of the pictures that have come out are faked, or are of children with pre-existing conditions. Notice you never see, like you do in other famines, multiple children or groups of adults looking skeletal. It's always one individual, usually a baby or an old man. As I said, Israel's put out, even in the last few days, medical records and pictures of some of these who are looking much better because they're being treated in Italy, etc. But the fact is the campaign is winning, and the West is playing into this a desire for Hamas to stay away from the negotiating table. This is causing Israel a lot of problems because, as I said, it doesn't. My belief is it doesn't really want to go into Gaza city. Many of the hostages are there. It's going to cost the Israeli soldiers a lot of lives. Going to have to call up hundreds of thousands of reservists, many of whom have seen hundreds of days already active duty over the last 2 years. They haven't seen their families as much as they would have liked, their businesses, their jobs, their lives. They're exhausted. Everybody who knows someone who's been through this, whether they're in the regular service or whether they're in the reserves, knows that it's an exhausted army, and they're being asked to come once again for what Netanyahu and the government are saying is for the final victory, but they've heard that many, many times before. So it's probably not something the Israeli government wants. It knows it's very problematic. It will do it if there is no deal on the table, because it has to push as much as possible, as I said, to try and push Hamas back to the table. But it is a real conundrum, and it doesn't seem at this point whether it's really going to achieve the success. There is talk of Hamas returning to some sort of negotiations in discussions with Egypt, who are putting a lot of pressure on Hamas to return to the table. But the question is now, what is the deal on the table? Over the last few days, the Israeli government, with these sort of high political sources, have said that we are not returning to these partial deals. There's going to be one deal, and that's it. The release of the hostages. Hamas have to lay down its weapons, surrender, and some other things, which is partly because of internal political consumption, but also this feeling that it's enough. Partial deals haven't worked; they haven't achieved the end of the war. So the message has been sent out now to the mediators that Israel is interested only in a full deal. I'm not 100% convinced that that's the only option on the table for the Israeli government. I do believe that the Israeli government would come back if there was a good partial deal on the table. But at the moment, that's what is being put out, certainly on unofficial from unofficial sources. Usually when it's a senior political source, we're talking about coming directly from Netanyahu's office. So this is obviously something Netanyahu wants to get across. It's a message he wants to get across without going publicly on record, because in the future, if he has to go back on this and agree to a partial deal, his name is not attached to this commitment not to do so. Alongside this, we've had quite a bit of a performative politics and posturing at lots of different levels, which is seen as very unseemly from within Israel, many different levels, from the security level to the political level. Let's start with the defense level. Now, for a couple of weeks now, since Netanyahu and his government, although hawkish elements of his government at least, have put on the table that they do want to conquer either all of Gaza or Gaza City as a first stage. It was clear that the relatively new IDF chief of staff, who's been in the job now 6 months, was against it for some of the reasons I laid out before, that there is a belief that they could harm hostages. It's, the Israeli army is absolutely fatigued, and it would lose a lot of soldiers in this, block-to-block fighting, this urban warfare, where Hamas really, that's what they want. They want to bring the Israeli army, the foot soldiers, into these, mazy, neighborhoods where they, to a certain extent, will be equalized against Israel's clear, superior power, but which mostly from above, from the air. But when it's hand-to-hand, combat, really in these mazy streets, it's where Hamas certainly could have an advantage. So for all these reasons, it's clear that Zamir and many of the others at the highest levels of the IDF were against these plans. As a result, he leaked his concerns to the public. That was met by leaks from Netanyahu and his people, ironically, or some opponents would argue ridiculously. Some of the main leaks are coming from the Netanyahu family, from his son, Yair, who's pretty much sat out the war in Miami, and even Netanyahu's wife, Sarah, who was leaked as saying that she knew that Zamir wouldn't be able to hold up to the pressure from the hostage families, who have been the main lobbyists from the beginning to end the war. And Yair Netanyahu basically blamed Defense Minister Yisrael Katz for Zamir's appointment, saying that he was the one who stood behind him. He was the one who put pressure on Netanyahu, the senior prime minister, to make this appointment, which is absolutely absurd. Netanyahu and Zamir go back many, many years. He was his military secretary, etc., etc. But these are the attacks. Zamir has suddenly found himself within a few weeks from being the knight in shining armor of the Netanyahu camp to replace the previous IDF chief of staff, Herzliya Levy, who was considered the failure of October 7th. His replacement, or his departure, was largely due to internal politics, partially to do with the whole ultra-Orthodox enlistment issue. But he was, along with the head of the Shin Bet, the previous defense minister, Yoav Gallant, and many others, they were the sacrificial lamb for policies that the Netanyahu government didn't want. But Zamir, he wasn't involved with the failures of October 7th. He's new in his job. He was appointed not by Benny Gantz, not by Naftali Bennett in the previous government, but by Netanyahu's government himself. But now he is the sacrificial lamb. Even we saw extraordinarily this week, there's already calls from within the government. Itamar Ben-Gvir has actually called for Zamir to be replaced already, which is quite bizarre. We're talking about a man who's been in a position 6 months, again, appointed by this very government. But he has now become the punching bag for Netanyahu and his supporters. It became so absurd in the last 24 hours that some of the appointments, not the highest level, medium level appointments in the IDF, that usually what happens is the chief of staff makes recommendations, and then usually that approval is immediately just signed off as a rubber stamp by the defense minister. We're not talking about the highest levels, which the defense minister would be familiar with. We're talking about medium level names that I'm sure he's not at all familiar with. Usually a defense minister doesn't get involved, but we saw a very public putting down Zamir by saying that all of your appointments, none of them will go through, and we'll start the process again the way I want to do it. This is what Yisrael Katz didn't just do behind closed doors, that did very, very publicly. And a lot of people are very angry about this situation, because for this sort of performative politics, this posturing, Israel is in the middle of a war. It is sending potentially hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens again off to the fronts. There's 50 hostages still being held in Gaza, and they see this public spat between the defense minister and the chief of staff, with the prime minister and some members of the family and other interested parties in the background, and it's leaving a very bad taste in his mouth. This is not particularly new, and we see it also happening in many other areas. We saw today, bizarrely, the justice minister, who shares an office in Tel Aviv with the Attorney General, changing the lock. So the Attorney General, who has become the other punching bag, in fact, she's been a punching bag for a good few years, couldn't enter her office. This is the situation we're in today. We are a year away from elections, probably, possibly, almost certainly a lot less than that. So we see a lot of performative politics. We do see a lot of posturing, and we see it in the Knesset. Even today, there was an attempt at the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee to pass the resolution that would allow the IDF to call up these hundreds of thousands for this offensive on Gaza City, and the government wasn't even able to get a majority, so it never even reached the table for a vote. Yuli Edelstein, the rebel within the Likud party, was replaced as chairman of that very same committee, didn't turn up with one other member of the government committee, and the opposition had the numbers to ensure that the vote didn't even come up because they knew they wouldn't be able to get a majority. Again, a real embarrassment for the government in the middle of this war, and it's causing a major rift within Israeli society because of all these different things that are going on. People are taking sides. We see lots of demonstrations, not just from the hostage families and those more on the left and the center, but also now for the ultra-Orthodox, because this week, 3 ultra-Orthodox deserters, those who received their call-up papers and refused to come and register and enlist in the army, were arrested. Actually, according to law, there should be thousands of arrests, but there were 3, and the ultra-Orthodox, many in the ultra-Orthodox community, I should say, demonstrated around the country. And we saw this absurd situation where they said that they are basically declaring war on the country and on the government and on the IDF after 2 years of the country being at war. So there are major, major divisions. A lot of people asking themselves, are these the kind of divisions that led to October 7th? Because Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar and many others, said they thought that Israel was weak in the lead up to October 7th, precisely because of these divisions. And that's what gave them the sort of feeling that they could do what they wanted on October 7th and could lead them to some sort of victory. And a lot of Israelis are asking themselves if we've just gone back to an October 6th mentality, especially with our highest level political figures, military figures leaking against each other with this performative politics and posturing. And there's this real sense of division in Israel because, and not just because of all these very, very important issues, but also because we are now entering the final year of this government with elections certain to happen within the next 12 months. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Ashley. There's certainly a lot going on. Now, we always seem to talk about the newest PR blunder facing Israel and the IDF almost every single week. This last week, there were 2 really interesting things I think happened. The first was the accusation of Israel targeting a prominent Al Jazeera journalist who turned out to be head of Hamas's East Jabalia brigade. And then the other was when the IDF exposed Hamas operatives who were masquerading and dressed as employees of the World Central Kitchen. And there was a bit of hope in the second one of those because the World Central Kitchen later confirmed that those identified in the IDF video are not affiliated with them. So with all that in mind, why do you think it's so easy for the anti-Israel crowd and just to cling on to these false narratives while rejecting the evidence of Hamas's activities that's right in front of their face?
The problem is, on these 2 specific cases, Israel actually did a good job on really exposing the truth. On the Hamas / Al Jazeera operative, Israel had already given evidence almost since the beginning of the war that this particular figure was receiving a a wage every month, a monthly wage from Hamas, and was a senior member in its rocket squad. Yes, he also moonlighted as an Al Jazeera journalist, but that should not shield him because he was involved in deadly attacks working for a genocidal organization. Israel had exposed with very good documentation his role in Hamas already, as I said, for almost 2 years. Unfortunately, when you get organizations, I heard on CNN there was a head of some international press organization saying it shouldn't matter if he works for Hamas, and comparing it to being a member of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or the Labour Party in the UK, said it matters just as much. It doesn't even matter that Hamas is a terrorist organization. So what can you say against that? And I did notice that the CNN interviewer didn't push back on that and say, well, there is a bit of a difference between Hamas and the Democratic Party or the Labour Party. But unfortunately, the average person around the world just hears that Israel killed a journalist. And we hear these sort of canards repeated by world leaders, and the job is done. It doesn't matter how much evidence Israel released, and you can really just Google it and you can find Israel's released information. But then you have, senior figures at the UN, in NGOs, in governments around the world who say Israel hasn't presented any evidence when that's clearly not true. As far as the what's it called, the World Kitchen.
World Central Kitchen, yeah.
World Central Kitchen, which is an aid humanitarian organization. Here was very interesting because Israel actually turned to the organization itself and said, is this group of 5 people with the logo on the roof, is this part of your people? Is this part of your organization? Are these your people? And they said, no, these are people masquerading. They've basically just taken our logo. They wear these big sort of vests with the logo on it, and they disguise themselves as humanitarian, but they were a terrorist organization. So after Israel got that information from the organization itself, it struck. We didn't hear any condemnation of that because it was clear what happened, but we also didn't hear any condemnation of Hamas, or very little condemnation of Hamas, who are masquerading as aid, humanitarian, assistance people. And that's what Israel said from the beginning, that, Hamas, places itself in hospitals, places itself in humanitarian spots, in schools, in mosques. Everything that Israel's been saying was really, that was a shining example of Israel being proven right. And the world basically just looked away. So it's very difficult. Israel did get that information out in real time, just like it did for the Al Jazeera / Hamas terrorist. But the world just simply didn't care. So, I can be critical of the Israeli government. I can be critical of our Hasbara efforts. But if no one is going to be producing it, publishing it, mentioning it in their press releases or in the international media, it's very, very hard to do too much against it. I did Google both of these events to see where it was published. And apart from Israeli papers or Jewish publications, very, very little was put out from Israel's point of view, even though it went extremely public on all its major government and army channels. So there was no lack of information out there. It just wasn't reproduced or published.
All right, thank you. Now, I'm going to a question from Kenneth and Elaine, who ask, why should Israel take over all of Gaza and risk exposing more of its soldiers to being kidnapped by Hamas?
Well, as I said, it's in a very difficult situation because we have to look at what are the other options. The other options are either standing still or retreating. Standing still won't put the necessary pressure on Hamas to return to the table, and retreating is very, it will send a very bad signal to Hamas and basically say that you've won. So unfortunately, in a war, you have to always be going forward to put pressure on the enemy to give up, to, in this case, not necessarily to surrender, but at least to come to the negotiating table in the hope that a deal can be struck. But it's very difficult to sort of just stand still. Now, the argument could be made, why are you sending in ground soldiers you can bomb from the air? Well, that's exactly what the international community has accused Israel of genocide, of intentionally targeting civilians, where we know that Israel wouldn't have to put one single foot soldier on the ground. It could have bombed everything from the ground, but precisely because it did not want to harm innocent civilians as much as possible, it has sent its soldiers in, and that has cost Israel hundreds of lives of its soldiers, but it's also saved arguably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Palestinian lives. Fighting in Gaza City is going to be far, far more difficult. Again, it could just pummel it from the air or send in rockets or whatever it is, but it knows that that's unacceptable. That's not what it's going to do. So it will be sending in its soldiers, and that's partially why Chief of Staff Zamir himself is, at least at first, was against the idea.
All right, many thanks. I'm going to a question now from Barak Korkmaz, who asks, is there a possibility of a flare-up between Turkish and Israeli forces in Syria? And does Israel evaluate helping Kurds in case of a Turkish intervention against the YPG?
Well, we did see an MOU today signed between Turkey and Syria, and there were comments, especially from the Turkish side, that Israel was interfering with Syrian sovereignty, and the whole situation in Soweto with the Druze was manufactured by Israel. It didn't really happen. There was no massacre, when clearly we've seen that there was, and Israel had to take action there. But it's clear that there is a difference of opinion between Ankara and Jerusalem about what should happen in Syria. Ankara has a big interest. Its interests largely are to do with the Kurdish population, to make sure that they're suppressed, to make sure that they do not join up with Kurdish populations in Turkey for any sort of move towards sovereignty or anything close to that. So those are the Turkish interests, and because of that, it's been cozying up and helping the nascent Syrian regime. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any cause for concern that there will be any direct confrontation between Israeli and Turkish soldiers. There isn't an interest from either side. There has even been some back channels to try and talk about how de-escalation can take place, something perhaps similar but on a different level to what we saw during the Assad regime between Israel and Russia, whereas Russia controlled and occupied large swathes of the country, but Israel still needed to defend itself and attack certain terrorist and government regime forces. There was an agreement and an understanding to how to go about it, so Israel and Russia wouldn't come into any direct confrontation. There has been talks behind the scenes on something similar with the Turks, but what we have seen from the Turkish government, at least, a real ramping up of the rhetoric against Israel, not just for what is happening in Syria, but also what's happening elsewhere. And some of the language has not been responded to as you might have thought in other times by Jerusalem, partially because it doesn't want to get into another line of confrontation.
All right, thank you. Now, going back to domestic policy inside of Israel, going to the issue of the draft here, Carrie would like to ask, Will Bismuth succeeded in pushing through a bill effectively exempting the Haredim from military service in the face of growing public anger?
It's a very difficult question. Will he be able to put something down on paper? Yes. Will it be acceptable to the ultra-Orthodox? Almost certainly no, because they are still taking maximalist position that not one single ultra-Orthodox person should be enlisted. Now, could they maybe find some other areas of agreement? Possibly yes, possibly no. But as we've seen, and as I've stated on many occasions, the ultra-Orthodox rabbinical and political leadership are taking maximalist position. Not only do they say that none of the ultra-Orthodox learning in yeshiva, learning Torah, as they call it, all day, they say that even those who are not learning all day and are working or are not in yeshiva, even those shouldn't be enlisted. So it's hard to find common ground at this point. They're trying. Boaz Bismuth, the new chair of the relevant Knesset committee, is certainly going to try and find something. And depending whether he's successful in October when the Knesset returns, will basically define, I think more than anything else, the pace of the election date next year, because if they really can't find something which could be relatively sold by Netanyahu to his public, then I think he'll give up and just call elections knowing that this government's days are numbered, and he won't have to compromise, as the questioner said, on a very sensitive issue, growing in anger by the day. So I think it all depends what bismuth brings to the table. But I think the likelihood is there won't be a law that will satisfy both sides. And it probably will mean in October that Netanyahu will make the decision to go for elections at some point early next year.
All right. Thank you very much, Ashley. We have unfortunately reached the end of our podcast for this week. I want to thank you again for taking the time to update us.
Thank you.
Of course. And of course, for our viewers and listeners, I want to thank you again for joining us and for your participation. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.